In this video, we will learn how to create arrays of strings. Since strings are objects, then we are technically learning how to create array of objects. We will talk about more complex objects in the following videos, but for now we are just going to stick to the strings. And understanding how Java deals with arrays of strings would makes it very easy for us to understand how Java deals with arrays of any other kind of objects. So it's the same concepts. So let's consider the scenario where we are building an array of strings that has 4 names, or points to 4 names to be more accurate. So here again, the same syntax. You are going to have the data type, which before it was int square brackets. Now since we are dealing with strings, we're going to name the class, which is string, and then followed by square brackets. So string square bracket, that means we have an array of strings. The reference variable in this case is going to be names, and then I'm going to list the values that I would like to be pointed to by this array. Now, this is the major concept that I would like you to understand, and if you understand this slide, then you understand what's coming for the next couple of videos until the end of the semester, honestly. So what is happening here is that when we create something like this, names is our reference variable, which will be in the stack memory. It will contain an address that is pointing to, and with that syntax, it's pointing to an array. Now, the difference here from what you may have expected is that it's not pointing to an array that contains Bill, Susan, Steve, and Jean. Instead, it's pointing to an array of reference variables pointing to these strings. So that's the tricky part. The reference variable names is pointing to an array of another reference variables. Each element in that array of reference variables is pointing to an actual array in actual string in the memory. So that is the tricky part. I think if like we want to visualize what people may have expected, it would be like this is pointing to that, which is not true. Its address is not pointing to an array that contains strings, because think about it in terms of a complex object. Could you contain it here inside that array? The answer is no. Instead, what you are actually pointing to is a reference variable list or array, which would have the same name of the reference variable here, except that it's just indexed with 0, 1, 2, 3. So name sub 0, name sub 1, name sub 2, name sub 3, all of these are sub-reference variables pointing to the actual strings in the memory. So let's think of it in this way here. We have string names is equal to new string with size 4. So here we are not pointing to any values. So what is really happening in the memory at this point is that names would have the address pointing to an array of reference variables, name sub 0, name sub 1, name sub 2, name sub 3. And since we have not assigned or made like names to point to anything at this point, each one of them is pointing to null. Then I go and manually assign one by one and say names of sub 0 is equal to Bell. So in this case, this, instead of pointing to null, gets updated with a new address, which is pointing to Bell in the heap memory. Name sub 1 is pointing to Susan, so that also happens here. Stephen, Jean, and so on. All right, so let's have a look at this in Java. All right, so I'm going to define a new string array, and here I'm going to do something like this, and then say here public static void main, and here is what you have been doing all of that time. If you remember at the beginning of this lecture, of this course, I told you this one we will learn towards the end of the semester. String square brackets, that's actually we are saying there is an array of strings called args. all right, or referenced by the reference variable args. So here we go. Then, and we will understand what does that mean, really, like this whole thing. But we understand the first part of it is that, or the whole thing actually, is that string of an array is called args, right? What do we mean by this? We will understand later on. So here I'm going to say a string square brackets is going to be called names is equal to new string and of size 4, right? And then I'm going to say let's at this point first of all system.out.println. What will happen if I try to print this? Names. All right, compile. Let's try to print this. It's going to tell you that it's a string, right, from the string class and at this location in the memory. All right, so that is what we are going to see. So if we want to see the contents, again, we have to process element by element. So I'm going to have another private static void and display array, which is going to take a string input array, and what it does is that it just goes in system.out.println, and it's going to print array. So here 4 int I is equal to 0, I is less than array.length I plus plus, and then what we want to do is to array sub I plus some kind of a space there, and that's what we want to do. All right, so let's make it print. Here we go. All right, just to make it look nice with the semicolon here missing. All right, something like this. All right, so here we are going to say display array. So you see what's happening here? Each one of the 4 elements pointed to or pointed at by names is actually what we are seeing here. Each one of them is pointing to null. All right, then I'm going to, before I do this, I'm going to say names sub 0 is going to point to Gene. All right, compile. See, now it's pointing to Gene. All right. Of 3 is going to point to Bob. All right, so that's what is happening when we do names sub 3 is equal to Bob. What we are actually doing is that we are saying here point to Bob. So now when you try to print it, it's printing the contents, which is the string, and in that case it's Bob. All right, others are not assigned, so it's going to be null. So that's how to declare and how to deal with array of strings. So the one thing that doesn't seem intuitive, but now you need to understand this, is that it points to an array of reference variables. These reference variables in turn are pointing to the actual objects in the memory. Now, since they are strings, each element of this array has its own stack of string methods. To uppercase, compare to, equals, char at, all of these can be accessed. All right. So one thing I could do is that I could say, for example, here, system.out.println. All right. Names of 0 dot char at 0, something like this. All right, which should be G. This is 0 0, so that would be J, right? So in that case, that would be the J in Gene. So so this you can access each element in the array of strings, and this will be treated as if a single string, and then you can operate on it using all the methods that we have learned dealing with strings. Now, the last thing we want to mention before we finish this is something I mentioned before, which is the length of an array and the length of a string in an array. All right. So we know strings, they have the length method, right? So for example, here I could go and say Gene dot length, and that is going to print an integer which tells me 4, because Gene has 4 characters. Now, what if I want to print the number of elements in the array names? So we say something like this, right? To make this 3 so we don't get confused. Here we go. So that's 3.length is going to check Bob. Bob has 3 characters. That's 3. Names.length, that is the actual array that we have, and it has 4 elements, and that's why names.length is equal to 4. Now the key here, the point of this slide is to tell you the difference between the length with parentheses and the length without parentheses. All right, this I cannot add to it. This one here, compile, it's not going to compile. It says cannot find symbol method length. There isn't a method length for names. Now the key difference here is that names is an array, and the arrays, they have a field that is public called length. All right, and that's why names.length works this way. And the strings, on the other hand, they have a method called length, and that's why the empty parentheses, this method does not take any parameters, but it's going to give you the length of the string. So that's why you have to be very careful. If I would like to print all the lengths of the strings inside the method called or the array called names, then I would loop from 0 up to names.length as the field, and then for every single element I would go and print the length by calling the length method. All right, so this is something to be very careful with, and it's a very common mistake that people mix the length with parentheses when it comes to the array, which is not correct, and the opposite with the strings. So that's how to create an array of strings. Taking that concept, you can expand it to any possible array of objects that you can think of, which we are going to do in the next videos.